We get to the title of this message. In this particular message, we're going back to the Apostle Paul writes a letter to the Jewish Christians. Therefore, it has the title of the book of Hebrews. And he's worried about them. And, and he says something very interesting. And I want to talk about what he says. It's about how and why the Lord's Sabbath rest is for us today. Now, I'm going to just summarize what he says, then we'll go into many of the scriptures. But it's all roughly from Hebrews 2 to Hebrews 4. And he says, Paul says to these Jewish Christians, remember our fathers, when they were ready to enter the Holy Land, the Promised Land. They call it the Holy Land, the Promised Land. They're on the border, and because of the spies, you all know the story. They actually tried to get rid of Moses' leadership, and they said, "We're not going in. Those Canaanites are too tough, and some of them are giants, and they were afraid to go." And that was like the 10th time they gave God problems, and God said, "Okay, you're not going in. Period. Only your children and grandchildren are going in. Every one of you, 20 years and up, you're going to die in the desert. God is mad at you." And actually, it would have been worse if it weren't for Moses. And Paul says, our Sabbath rest is a practice of going into the Holy Land that we should do every week. And the reason that the Israelites didn't go in is because they didn't really believe in God. Not really. They didn't really trust God. They had no faith, and they were disobedient, pagan-oriented, stiff-necks. That's the word that God used. And he's telling these Jewish Christians who are starting to slip, backslide, to buck up, and the seventh-day Sabbath rest will help them. And one of the things that Christ said in his day that you have to think about to fully understand it. Christ said, the Sabbath was made for us, not for God. God didn't need the rest. And when you think about it, it's obvious, but I don't think the Pharisees and the scribes and the Sadducees understood that until Christ told them. All of this is made for us, for mankind. And one day the whole world will be doing it, but the resting is for us. And I'm going to quote Mark 2:24 to 28. We're just going to read the important parts of it. Most of you know the scripture, but Mark 2. Look, said the Pharisees to him, why are your disciples doing things on the Sabbath day against the law? Now, they meant against their rules. They had 620, some say even more, Sabbath restrictions. Yeah, you can read all kinds. If you were a tailor, you couldn't have a needle in your pocket, and you could only carry so much in one hand. And actually, in the modern day, they can't press elevator buttons. They can't flip light switches on, turn burners on and off. I could go through a whole long list of things that even modern day Hasidic Jews can't do. And then basically Christ said, have you not read what David did when he was needy and hungry? And he just said, God is not that inflexible. He made an exception on that particular priest law because David and his men were on the run and they were starving. God made exceptions. God is not a petty little tyrant like they were. Actually, Christ said in many places that they were in bondage, meaning the Jewish people under bad leadership. The Sabbath, he told them, this is the key part, verse 27, was made for man. The Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. Your leadership has you serving the day instead of the day serving you. So the Son of Man is master even of the Sabbath. Christ is the master of the Sabbath. And you can see that in other parts of the Bible, in the book of Luke, and I won't go into those other healings, but the same thing is revealed. They tried to trap Christ on several occasions. This day is meant to rejuvenate us, to build us up, to teach us about God, to have fellowship with God, and with each other, and to rest. Now, Paul is paraphrasing Psalms 95, 7 through 11. And all the commentaries tell you that's what he's doing. But, Paul had inspiration even beyond the Bible. Now, he does do a good job of fleshing out the meaning of Psalms 95, but he adds even more to it because Paul is inspired. He takes what God had given them in the Bible and Psalms, and he adds to it even more. And that's what we're going to look at. So I'm going to go to Hebrews 3:11, but the whole thing, the whole section of those 2 chapters is helpful. Hebrews 3:11. Hebrews 3:11. So, and now he's, of course, quoting Psalms, which is quoting God. So I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. Beware, brethren, lest there be any of you with an evil, unbelieving, mind, and departing from the living God. As he quotes that first part of Psalms 95, he says, we could fall into the same trap that the Israelites did. A lack of trusting and believing in God. I mean, most of us, when we look at those scriptures in Numbers and the other places described in Deuteronomy, say, wait a minute. They already saw God crush the Egyptian army in the Red Sea. And they were the number 2 empire in the world. The Egyptians say they were number 1, but regardless. So why didn't they trust God? To us, it doesn't make any sense, but that's how carnal they were. Hebrews 3:13. Hebrews 3:13. But exhort one another daily, while it is called today, because that's mentioned, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. It's like that was the key day for the Israelites, but these are key days for us. And I like the expression deceitfulness of sin. I think as we all get older, we understand it. There are people who steal, or they're con men, or they get involved in illicit sexual things, and there are all kinds of sins. And it may seem, in drugs, and it may seem fun, but in the long run, it's going to come back to bite them. And maybe their family members that are close to them. Sin has a deceitfulness, like a hook. It grabs you. I heard a discussion on the radio, and I wanted to say something. This lady was saying, I think it's some popular movie star, that she had aborted 1 or 2 babies, and she couldn't have had her wonderful life in Hollywood if she hadn't murdered those babies. She says, and that's why most women abort babies, so they can have more happiness and fun in life, and the baby is going to get in the way. And of course, as this one guy argued, he said, well, what if your neighbor somehow restricts your fun? Are you allowed to go murder him? But here's what I know. I can sense it. The day will come when at least many of those ladies will regret not having those kids. I know you're probably thinking, they're having plenty of fun out there. They're not, I bet the day will come when they will regret it. And their life will be less full because of what they did. In other words, sin is deceitful, like a hook. It grabs you, and like it grabbed the Israelites. They went for the golden calf, and they kind of had a wild party, and I'm sure it was a lot of fun, but it was bad for them. And their hearts were hardened. We have to worry about that happening to us too. Verse 14, for we have become partakers of Christ if we hold the beginning of our confidence steadfast to the end. While it is said, again he's back to Psalms 95, today if you will hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion. You don't want to be like those Israelites that refused to go up the hill into the promised land. And to whom did he swear that they would not enter his rest? Because they did not obey. The Israelites refused to enter because they didn't trust God and they were disobedient. And Paul's warning these Christians, they probably were, because Christianity started in Jerusalem, they probably were early converts, probably maybe a decade earlier than some of the churches Paul started. And they've been waiting for Christ to come back. And I can see how it would happen. We thought he had come back 10 years ago. We've been in this church for 25 years and Christ still hasn't come back. And now some of our Jewish relatives, they didn't persecute them in a bloody way, but they probably putting financial screws to them and social screws. And this isn't, it's not as much fun as it was before. And the world has an alluring attraction. I want to get back into the fun of whatever they want to get back into. And Paul is saying, don't get discouraged. And he says, every Sabbath rest is a practice of being an obedient person of God and going into the Holy Land. It's like you practice every Sabbath rest of going into the Promised Land every week. And they say, actually coaches say, practice doesn't make perfect, but perfect practice makes perfect. Make your practice better and better, more realistic. And animals practice. You ever watch little kittens play? And they're playing being a hunter because, they're predators. And they sneak up and they pretend to, even if the other cat doesn't know they're there, or they pretend to pounce on him. They're not really trying to hurt each other, but look like they're fighting, and dogs do that too. They're practicing being a predator. And you'll see that with a lot of animals. They love chasing little things as if they were out there chasing a mouse. Well, God says practice following God into the Promised Land. Now, our Promised Land is going to be a spiritual one. It's the true Promised Land. Now, the Israelites were going into prosperity, and their children and grandchildren did go into a Promised Land that was prosperity, and at least for a few generations, they didn't mess it up too much. They had their ups and downs, but we're going to go into a spiritual Promised Land. Now, every week is the day to practice that rest. And it'll help lead us away from the sinful world. Every week, stay strong, stay in the fight, as Mr. Polk said. Now, this is a stupid, corny joke, but it maybe has a purpose. Mrs. Doofus, they were having a party with some of their relatives, and there's a creek nearby, and they said, boy, there's a ton of mushrooms down there. We could cook those with garlic and butter and oil, and it'd be really good. But another friend said, yeah, but they might be poisonous. It's hard to tell. She said, I know what I'll do. I'll go harvest a big bowl of them, and I'll feed them to the dog, Old Spot. And I'll watch him. As long as Old Spot is fine, we can eat him. So she got a big bowl and sauced them up, put some out for Old Spot. He scarfed them up. He eats anything she puts in front of him. And he trots outside to play. She says, hey, he's doing okay. We don't have to worry about a thing. So they all started eating them. They were eating them and burping. They were just picking down on them. And all of the neighbor comes in and he says, Old Spot is dead. And he wanted to say some more. He said, but quiet. I got to call the doctor. They called the doctor. The doctor says, poisonous mushrooms. You're not dead yet. Meet me at the emergency room. Get there as fast as you can. We all run in the car. Go to the emergency room. The emergency room, they pump their stomachs and they give them enema. So they're getting it out from both ends, if you think of that. So they come back home and they are really sore and beat down and their stomach feels horrible on the couch. The neighbor says, I want to finish telling you the story about Old Spot. Okay. Would you believe the guy that ran him over didn't even stop? He didn't even stop. Now you're saying, how can you use that story in this sermon? Well, I'll stretch it. If they had waited patiently and listened to the rest of the story, they could have saved themselves a lot of stomach pumps and enemas. Well, isn't that what Paul is really telling the Israelites? He's saying, don't give up too soon. Keep listening. And every Sabbath rest you can practice by keeping the Sabbath, going in to the Promised Land. I'm going back to Hebrews 4, chapter 1. And this kind of adds to what we said last night in the pod, but we didn't get into this part of the pod. Actually, it was such a good pod. We got to this part late in the script, so we didn't get much emphasis. Hebrews 4:1. Therefore, since a promise remains of entering his rest. In other words, it's still out there for us, entering God's true rest. Let us fear lest any of you seem to come short of it. Verse 3. For we have believed, do enter that rest. As he said, I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. That was the Israelites going into the promised land. Verse 4. For he has spoken in a certain place of the seventh day in this way, and God rested on the seventh day from all his works. And again, in this place, they shall not enter my rest. In other words, he's going back to Psalms 95. Those Israelites would not enter his rest. Why? Because they had no confidence in God. They didn't trust God. Even though they'd seen great miracles, they just didn't have it in them. Now, God will straighten all that out in the world tomorrow, but for the moment, they didn't. So what we need to do is strengthen our trust in God, our faith in God, and also, I think even when things don't go our way, don't get discouraged, because God didn't promise us a picnic. If you look at all the scriptures. So when things don't go well, don't get discouraged. Keep our trust in God. That's what the Israelites couldn't do. Hebrews 4:6. Matter of fact, I think God tested them 10 times, including going up the hill into the promised land. And they failed every single test. Verse 6, Hebrews 4. They failed to enter because of disobedience. Again, he sets a certain day. Today, saying through David so long afterwards in the words already quoted. In other words, he's already quoted this once. He's quoting Psalms 95 a second time. Today, when you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not speak later of another day. In other words, looking at Psalms 95, going into the promised land with Joshua was only step one, if you want to call it, the physical practice of the nation going into the promised land. There is a spiritual version of that that's much greater that we're practicing for. So then, there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. Verse 9. For whoever enters God's rest also ceases from his labors as God did from his. And then Paul says, let us strive. And then it's, push. Let us strive to enter that rest, that no one fall by the same sort of disobedience. Because he was worried about them. And I can understand that they were seeing signs that they wanted to slip back into society, be popular again, and whatever sinful things they wanted, I can understand it. And many of us may experience that. We've often expected God to be back in a few years. Natalie and I certainly thought we would live to see the return of Christ. But I'm going to pick a number. I could be wrong, so you all know speculate. What if the end is 12 or 13 years away? And it could be. It may take a long time for the world to get as bad as it's described in Revelation. I mean, it's getting bad, but it could get worse. I know you're thinking, can it get worse? We were actually listening to someone who preached a sermon in 93, and in the sermon he talked about Bill Clinton wanting to openly have gays serving in the military. And he said, this is the end. America's going down a moral road that's going to be total debauchery. Now, it was bad for America and bad for the military. I won't go through all the debate that all happened the next couple of years after that. But as bad as you think the 90s were, it's worse now. And it could be worse 7 or 8 years from now. I'm not saying I know that, but it could be. In other words, many of us will probably pass away, hopefully in Christ, before Christ gets back. If that happens, don't get discouraged. As a matter of fact, as one man said, do you really want to see how bad it's going to get in the end? Maybe you would be better off not to see it. But, we can kick that around. So all I'm saying is Paul is telling these people, don't get discouraged. Now, Paul still thought the end was maybe 5-10 years ahead of him. As it turned out, Paul and Peter both were martyred around 67, 68 in Rome. Paul had a quick death, fortunate for him. But the point I'm getting at is, without seeing the end, and you can sense in Paul's writing, near the end, he knew he would not see the return of Christ. So sure, disappointments happen. But don't let those disappointments discourage you. God is real, even though the end may not. Now, it might come in 4 years, and we'll all be alive to see Christ return. And if that happens, whatever God does, needless to say, it's wonderful, right? But it could be 12 years away. You think things are bad now, they could get worse. Like in the 90s, they thought it couldn't get any worse. Well, it got worse. We still need to rest. We need to practice going into God's holy land every Sabbath. We need to get closer to God. We need to learn more about God. We need to learn how to be more like God. We need to have more of God's love. And God knew people would need rest. God knew people would need renewal. That's why the Sabbath is here. God knew that we need to give a certain amount of our time to Him every week. And true Christian fellowship is needed too. Obviously, many people can't have that because of people being scattered. But if you can have it, you should take advantage of it. Christian fellowship is good. And we need to hear the Word of God expounded. We need, at least for so many hours, a shelter from worldly influences. One man said he was watching, actually it was a conservative news outlet, for many, many hours. He said it got discouraging. And so sometimes you need to take a break from news. I'm not saying we don't want to understand or even discuss it, but you need to sometimes, listen to some Christian music. Just try to pull away, especially from the worst ones. There's some better than others. But we need to feel positive. We need to start going in the direction of God. And this, every Sabbath rest, as Paul said, there still is a Sabbath rest for the people of God. It's like practicing going into the promised land. Roughly, we think we'll have 6,000 years, like a week of the devil's world, and then 1,000 millennium, like 1/7. So like 1/7 of the week is God's time, and going into the promised land and helping others. Actually there are some, I'll just describe this real quickly. One of the times when the Pharisees were getting on Christ's case about healing, actually he didn't have to work. All he had to do was just say it. You're healed. It happened. But they still said, you're breaking our rules anyway. And Christ looked at them and said, if any of you had a sheep that fell at a crevice, wouldn't you work hard to get that sheep out, even if it was on the Sabbath? You wouldn't let it die. Of course they wouldn't, because that sheep is money. Most of them were, farmers, ranchers. Of course they would. That wasn't against the rules. And he says, and I'm helping a daughter of Abraham who suffered all these years. What are the Pharisees going to say? They can't beat that argument, so they had to shut up. We're embarrassed and angry. But this is a day to help other people, to show love. And one thing we can do to show love, you probably can't do a whole lot for other people, but if you can encourage them, if you can build them up, if you can, I think Ken said this well in the podcast, if you can empathize with them, share their pain, and also share their victories. I think Tom may have said something similar. If we can share what other people are going through. And by the way, there's a study that shows now that we're more electronically connected through smartphones and tablets and all kinds of devices. The odd thing is, when they do surveys on loneliness, people in the most connected electronic world in history are more lonely. I know that doesn't seem to make sense, but face-to-face contact is better. I'm not putting down smartphones and FaceTime that's on your phone, all those wonderful electronic things, but there's something like that you can't replace human interaction with electronics. We need it. So when you come, you can help people be healthier. Also, Hebrews 10:23. This is all the same letter, so just bouncing around. He says, let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering. In other words, stay strong, you Jewish Christians in Jerusalem. Don't give in, for he who promised is faithful. Verse 34, let us consider how to stir up one another to love. Now, when he says stir up one another to love, it means you encourage them. You buck them up. You say, well, they're putting pressure on you on your job. I went through that 4 years ago. Don't give up. Be tactful and nice and all that, but don't give up. Do whatever you think God inspired you to do, and God will help you. And when you're on God's side, he'll back you up. So, stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together as habit of some is, but encouraging one another. I want to emphasize the word encouraging one another. Encouraging one another. And all the more as you see the day drawing near. And we are probably going to live in an age when we will see the day drawing near. At least we think this. When you look at Babylon the Great, the beast and the false prophet, and everyone will worship the beast, doesn't that sound like a vast, at least somewhat worldwide dictatorship? Doesn't that sound like that to you? And now that they have these electronic things, one of the things the Canadian truckers don't like is the vaccine passport. And I'm told they have all kind of other electronic things on that passport. And the government can add more. And I think they were having to go through checkpoints when they crossed the border and other places. And they told the truckers, well, now, regardless of certain things, you got to spend 2 weeks in quarantine, which means the truckers don't get to make money. And that was like the last straw. But the vaccine passport, now you think about a world-ruling, or mostly world-ruling dictatorship. And they're using electronics. And maybe it'll be on your smartphone, maybe it'll be on your driver's license, but they'll have an electronic version. And to do certain things, to go in certain stores, restaurants, fly on airplanes, you got to show it to them. Think of the control that will give them. You get on and China's doing this now. China has cameras everywhere. They get a social score. I'll bet you, now they have an underground church in China, which is quite big. They say it's maybe several million members. And some of them are Sabbath keepers. Well, they actually send spies in. If they catch some people in one of those churches, usually the leaders go to one of their gulags. They call them re-education prisons, but you ought to read about how many they're really horrible things. And then your score gets lowered, so you can't do anything. Well, can't you see that maybe they're getting the public used to blind obedience and to being controlled electronically? I'm going to give an opinion. Even if they know that the vaccine has limited use, especially as new variants come out, and that masks don't work. I know you can argue, oh, yes, they do work a little bit. No, the viruses are so tiny, they float in the air. Unless you stop breathing for 24 hours, eventually it's going to get you anyway. Even if you're in a high-tech mask, you got to breathe anyway. It's in the air. And because it's manufactured in a lab, it's also in animals. Because generally, viruses are locked into one species. Well, they call it the gain of function research. This virus is also in some animals. That makes it even in nature even more. You're going to mask up all the animals, bats, cats, because it came out of bats. Bats, cats, and dogs can get it. Now they say, what about rabbits? They're rodents too. Who knows? Maybe rats and mice, which is scary because there's a lot of rats out there. But the point I'm getting at is, even if they know the masks don't work, they're going to ride this as long as they can because they want you to get used to blind obedience. And you'll see a lot of parties where the elites are all running around maskless. Now, people serving them all have masks on. Now, I could be wrong, and maybe the vaccine has some abilities to do certain things, but I don't think it even matters What matters is that you're taught to blindly obey. Can you see this would be the lead up to a kind of socialized, they call it statism, where you worship the state. And when you go back to people in the French Revolution, some of the great philosophers that led to the French Revolution, I won't go into all the details because it'll bore you, but he said people should be loyal to one thing, not family, not religion, not traditions, not all kinds of other regional alliances, but to the government. And of course, the leader of the government. You worship the state. Can you see the world is moving toward big government, statism? Even if you have a non-charismatic leader, it doesn't matter. It's the principle of the thing. And by the way, they said, well, the government isn't doing it all. Businesses are doing a lot of it. By the way, that was how fascism differed from communism. They both were socialistic, it was a National Socialist Party. But Mussolini and Hitler, they recruited especially big businesses to do a lot of their dirty work for them. And you now see that trend in American big business. It's kind of scary. The government says this or that. You see, the courts can say, well, the government can't make you do it, but private business, that's my private business. If I demand all my employees do this or that, or they get fired, you see what I mean? Now, I'm not trying to scare you. All I'm saying is we are moving closer to the end. I don't know how close we are, and I don't want to cry wolf, wolf, because we could be more, this may take longer to evolve with ups and downs and but can't you see the media pushing America toward more immorality, toward more government power, regulatory agencies regulating your life, and people blindly following along regardless? That's the thing. Even if you do believe in masks, I don't think it matters. It's blind obedience that they want you to learn. And we will see how it all falls out. Okay, well, what's the goal of our Sabbath day rest and rejuvenation? It obviously is to practice going into the Holy Land, or the Promised Land, which is God's kingdom. And I'm going to go to the same letter, Hebrews 10:16. This is my last scripture, but this is kind of the goal. And by the way, Paul isn't bringing up anything new. Jeremiah 31:31 says pretty much the same. Paul is just giving it a new covenant emphasis. Hebrews 10:16. This is the covenant that I will make with them after those days, says the Lord. By the way, can you see the word covenant means agreement? I'm not saying the Ten Commandments aren't important and all that stuff. Of course they are. And sometimes the Bible word stuff, the covenant of God, the Ten Commandments. But it's just a matter of semantics. And there are a ton of other scriptures, and it's clear God made all kinds of agreements with other people, with Noah, with David. And the word covenant just means agreement, just so anybody doesn't get confused. And we can rattle off a bunch of scriptures. But he's just saying, here's the agreement, or the covenant. Now, covenant is a serious spiritual agreement, but it's still an agreement. Here's the covenant I will make with them after those days, says Lord. In the future, I will put my laws in their hearts and write them on their minds. Wow, so we can be more like God. Isn't that the goal of what we should achieve in our Sabbath day rest and as our life between now and then? Obviously, human nature will give us trouble, so it's going to be a battle. But that's the goal. It's not just something on a tablet that you try to obey. God says, I'm going to put it in your heart. I'm going to put it in your mind. And I mean, human nature is still going to be a problem. But just remember, there remains a Sabbath day rest. And I would say rest well and really, really believe in God.